How are you all doing tonight? Doing good? Good. Anybody stay up late watching the elections? Yeah. Yes? Okay. I came home very late, so it wasn't a long night, a long time to stay up till the end of the election, so I decided to stay. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about free will. What it is, whether we have it or not, and what impact that has on our lives. So before we start, I have just some questions that I wanted to run by you. Keep in mind, and hopefully we'll try to answer them through tonight's talk. And maybe if there's a discussion, if you have some questions after, if I don't get to answer all these questions tonight, you can ask afterwards and we'll try to get an answer. So is free will an illusion? Is free will about being able to do anything at any time? For example, does a prisoner in a jail cell not possess free will because he's not able to go outside of his cell? Are we really free to make decisions? And to think about this, are we really free to make decisions? Are there influences on our decision-making process? And if so, what are these things? Does a chess-playing computer have free will? Do human beings have free will in the same sense? Does imagination or creativity have any impact on free will? And does being able to predict or being predictable negate free will? So if you're the kind of person who's very predictable, does that mean you have no free will? And what is the relationship between biology and free will? Are we truly responsible for our own decisions and actions? And what is the difference between causes and reasons? And what about beliefs and desires? Can addictions affect the free will? Can they enslave a person's will and desire? And what do internal and external influences have to do with free will? How does morality relate to free will? And is freedom experienced when one does what they like or when one does what they ought? And is virtue possible without free will? Can one, for example, be a hero where it is impossible to be a coward? Is love possible without freedom? How can freedom be found through slavery, even if it is to God? And is freedom from something the same as freedom for something? Do God's commandments limit or guard freedom? So we're going to try to tackle most of these questions tonight. Like I said, if we don't get to all of them, if something sticks in your mind, you can ask afterwards and we'll be happy to discuss them. What is free will? So when you look around today, when you go, for example, online, when you watch a TV show, when any interaction with media, any sort of interaction with your friends, and the topic of free will comes up, any sort of idea about free will, it's always about having choices, being able to choose. And philosophically, on a very, very basic level, is defined as follows. A kind of power or ability to make decisions of the sort for which one can be morally responsible. Very basic definition. Some even argue that free will requires alternate possibilities. Like, for example, when Henry Ford first came up with the automobile and started mass producing it, he said you can have any color you want as long as it's black. Is that really free will? If you don't have alternate, some people argue that free will needs that in order to be real. Some even argue that free will requires that the I, be the ultimate source of my free actions, or the ultimate source of my will to perform free actions. So there are no influences. Digging a little deeper, you'll find a little bit more distinctions between different views on free will. So, for example, there is the deterministic view, that everything is determined, everything is predetermined, that you're not really free to choose anything, that you're just following in a sort of domino effect, that you really had no other option but to be the person you are today, and to be at the place you are today, and to make the choices that you made today. So for you guys to be here in this meeting today, you're not really free to be here or not. It was determined a long time ago, and the outcome of everything led you to this place at this moment. That's kind of hard determinism. That the universe has exactly one physically possible future, and it suggests that there's only one course of events that is possible and is determined causally. Everything has a cause and it determines effects. And this is different from fatalism. We talk about fate. You hear about fate all the time. It's even in our language. It's fate. Right? Fate is the view that no matter what I do, the outcome cannot change. You cannot outrun your fate, they say, right? So fate means that no matter what you do, you cannot change the outcome. But if determinism is true, then free will cannot be true. But what is that view of free will that does not or is not compatible with determinism? That's called libertarian free will. Being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, no boundaries, no restrictions, no limits, and is distinct from any sort of political view. It holds that free will exists and that it is incompatible with determinism. So libertarian free will. And some people believe in that. There's the compatibilist view, that things are compatible between free will and determinism. That both these things can exist. This view holds that free will can exist in a deterministic universe. Or that free will is compatible somehow with determinism. So maybe the universe on a physical level is deterministic. But us, human beings, we're able to exercise free will. And then finally there is that incompatibilist view that holds that free will is incompatible with determinism. It's incompatible with the world being deterministic. Many philosophers argue that there is some sort of determinism in the world, and attribute free will, or the feeling of it, to a sort of bunch of physical processes in the brain. So it just feels like free will, but it's reducible to something happening in your brain, and to you it looks like free will. Just like to you it looks like consciousness, or memory, or feelings. But they claim that it's all reducible to some sort of physical process in the brain. And it's very, very difficult to support philosophically or scientifically that things are actually reducible to this level. Some physicists argue that the universe is in fact deterministic, meaning with a similar sort of problem. At the quantum level, and this is where most of the research is at today, at quantum level, quantum mechanics, determinism begins to break down. Things aren't predictable anymore. So events at the quantum level cannot be predicted, and that is a matter of principle. It's not something that maybe we need to look into, we need to research some more. It's as a matter of principle, you cannot predict things at the quantum level, which kind of goes against a deterministic universe. So far we're talking very philosophically, scientifically, very broad. We're going to bring it down to earth right away. You go to a store, the whole bunch of different kinds of jam. We're fasting, we need to go buy something to eat. There is so many different kinds, 24 choices. You think that this is going to be better for you, that you're going to be able to make a choice, make a decision. Which one do I want? Pick the one you want. There's more options. I'm going to be happier. I'm going to get the one that I like the most. But research shows that the more choices you have, the less decisions you're able to make. In in a store where there were 24 choices of jam, many more shoppers were attracted, and it ended up only 3% of them actually buying jam. Whereas another store had only 6 choices, only 40% were attracted, but 30% bought jam. It's called the agony of choice. It's difficult. The more options you have, the more you have to sit there and evaluate all the options and see if things are going to work out or not. Maybe this kind of jam is a little bit better to my taste buds, or maybe this is a little bit healthier, right? And you end up not choosing anything. So this is where we're kind of at today. If we move back a few centuries, we'll see that how things really evolved. 16th century. We're looking at a debate between two groups, the Calvinist group and the Armenian group. An Armenian group had nothing to do with the country of Armenia. It goes with, they're the followers of a Dutch theologian called Jacob Arminius, and they wrote things in the 16th century called the Remonstrance. And these things basically were a refutation or questions or disagreements with the thoughts or the views of another group of people in the Reformed movement called the Calvinists. So Calvinism and Arminianism, this was a big divide. Most people today in the Reformed tradition, in the Protestant churches, fall either in the Calvin side or the Arminian side or somewhere in between. So the hard Calvin side, they have these 5 points of Calvinism. Okay? And there's an acronym for it. To remember, it's called TULIP. Okay? T-U-L-I-P. TULIP. And the Armenian side, and this was a response to what the Armenians said. So the Calvinist side believe in something called total depravity. You know what total depravity means? Somebody's totally depraved. Totally depraved. When somebody's depraved, there's no good in them. It's all evil, all bad, all base, right? All negative. They cannot come up with any positive thought, anything good. They cannot do anything good on their own. They're just completely depraved. And interestingly enough, the difference between a Calvinist and a Catholic, just one letter. Where the Calvinist believes in total depravity, the Catholic would say, no, it's not depraved, it's deprived. It's an I, not an A. The grace is deprived. It's taken away. It's not that there's nothing good in the person. But either way, they believe in total depravity. So there's nothing good in human beings. The Armenian side, on the other hand, believe in something called partial depravity. So you're partially depraved. And there's something called the prevenient grace or preceding grace. This is called the Old English language. Preceding grace, and that's the kind of grace, the initial impulse that God sends to you, and He makes you want to do something good. And then you react with that, you interact with it, and then you go ahead and want to do something good, and you get that feeling that you want to do something good, and you make the decision, but it all comes from God. That's the preceding grace, the initial impulse to want to do something good. The second point, the U, unconditional. Unconditional election means that the saints are elected, they're chosen, there's a number for them, they're chosen, there's really nothing they can do in order not to be chosen, they're chosen. That's it. Versus conditional election. The Armenians believe that there's no such thing as unconditional election, that it is conditional based on certain things, but it is conditional on, for example, on their faith, on their lives, and things like that. Limited versus unlimited atonement. The Calvinists believe in limited atonement, that the atonement of Christ on the cross was only for those who are elected, for those who are chosen. So it's not for all of humanity whoever existed and whoever will exist, it's just for those small number of people. These are the only people who are atoned for. And this is the only group of people that Christ's blood is saving. Versus unlimited atonement. The Armenian side would believe that no, the blood of Christ was for everyone, it was universal. The fourth point, irresistible grace versus resistible grace. So the Calvinists believe that the grace of God coming to you, that visitation of grace, is irresistible. There's really nothing you can do to say no to the grace coming from God. And finally, perseverance of the saints. The saints, the elect, the chosen, would persevere no matter what, and they would end up going to heaven, and that's all there is to it. The Armenian side came up with something different, or actually they had something different, to which the Calvinists responded, but they said eternal security. You hear that term, or you might read it sometime in some Protestant books. Eternal security. It's an Armenian term, and it refers to how they view their eternal life, how they view their eternity and the condition upon which this eternity is based. Eternal security. So, they had this debate in the 16th century. Do we really have free will? Do we not have free will? Is it all from God? Is there anything good in us? Right? And it was a big controversy at the time. And even until today, it's not completely settled. Like I said, some people take all five on the Calvinist side, some people take all five on the Armenian side, some people take a mix of both. Moving back a few centuries, St. Augustine. At the time, he was, by the way, he began his life away from God, and on a trip to Rome, he meets with someone called St. Ambrose of Milan. And in that place, St. Ambrose tells him about this book he just read, and that it changed his life, and that St. Augustine should read it. And it was called The Life of Anthony by St. Athanasius. So he goes, he takes it, he reads it, and then this changes his life. He leaves everything, begins the path of repentance, and bit by bit gets baptized, and so on and so forth. So what happened? Pelagius is a British monk who had some ideas, some different ideas about grace, about what the grace of God really means, and what the free will of humanity really means, and how they both interact with each other. So, St. Augustine's teaching on grace and free will elaborated in the face of the Pelagian heresy during the second decade of the 5th century, and made its way to southern Gaul in the early 420s. While Pelagius had thought that human beings were able to perform virtuous acts that would merit salvation, thanks to their natural gifts alone, and that in fact they were obliged to perform what they were capable of doing. So basically, Pelagius would say that any commandment that God gives us, we have everything we need inside of us to do it. We don't need any external help, not even the help of God. It's all about working hard. You can do it. God gave you everything in you to do what needs to be done, to follow His command. St. Augustine, on the other hand, went on the other side. He said he denied the power of such gifts to accomplish anything whatsoever of enduring value. So someone not Christian, would they be able to do anything good? St. Augustine would say, earlier in his life, would say, no. Even if he does something good, it's not lasting. It would kind of erode or just lose its efficacy with time. It's not going to last. And he had placed this denial in the context of an understanding of divine predestination. And that's where we get the connection between the idea of predestination and St. Augustine. That suggested the valuelessness of all human effort to be virtuous. So to him, it was about grace. And St. Augustine at the time, he's fighting a heresy. So he's speaking so much about grace. This was earlier in his life that he kind of went to the other side, to the extreme. Later on in his life, he writes what we call the retractions. where he takes back some of these things. He says that this cannot be, and I'm going to read to you some of the stuff he writes later on in his life to show that he really does take the middle position. He's not as extreme as the West makes him out to be, because these retractions that he wrote later in life are mostly ignored in the West. They just take the earlier writings and go with those. So you can imagine a monastic, Pelagius, saying that you have to work hard, asceticism, all that stuff, and St. Augustine saying predestination, grace. How would this be viewed? How would this be accepted or not by a monastic community? Probably not very well, because he's saying all the stuff you guys do is not important, is not sufficient. It's really all about grace. So they were very upset with him. So he writes to them, he goes to them and explains. But before then, he accused Pelagius of thinking of God's grace as consisting only of external help. So God's just out there, he can help you if you want. That's what St. Augustine is accusing Pelagius of. So it should be noted that in his retractions, later in life, he writes two books. He says on nature and grace. That's the title of the first. And the second one is on grace and free will, to rectify his position on the issue. And this is what he writes. There is, to begin with, the fact that God's precepts themselves would be of no use to a man unless he had free choice of will, so that by performing them, he might obtain the promised rewards. So since we're speaking on St. Augustine and Pelagius, we have to talk just a little bit, very briefly, and this is not the subject of tonight, but just very briefly on the original sin. I know this is a hot topic, this is a bit controversial. I'm glad things are being recorded, so that if I say anything wrong, it's on the record, and it can be corrected. So where Pelagius would say he had, or his followers had three positions that they progressed through in their thinking. The first was that Adam would have sinned, would have died whether he sinned or not. Adam would have died whether he sinned. So the church came and said, you know what? The Bible is very clear about this. We don't need to discuss or anything. It says, therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men. St. Paul is very clear that death entered through sin. And he wasn't just going to die on his own. But by the envy of the devil, death came into the world. We say this where? In the liturgy, right? By the envy of the devil, death came into the world. No, death didn't just come in on its own. Here are the verses. Their second position was that Adam would have died. Oh, this is continuing with the first position actually. They kept going. They said to him, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Right? God's giving them a direct command and a consequence for breaking it. And that consequence is death. So that consequence wasn't there had they not broken. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Again, it's very clear that this is a consequence of sin. And finally, the verse from 1 Corinthians. For since by man came death, by man, capital M, also came the resurrection of the dead. St. Paul is making it as clear as possible that death came into the world. It was not part of the world. It came in. And that whosoever, says that Adam, the first man, this is, by the way, the Council of Carthage. This was a group, a bunch of councils, about 18, 19 of them. And they came up with all these canons, and they grouped them together in what is known as the Canons of Carthage for all the 19 councils. So, Canon 109 is very clear. It says that whosoever, says that Adam, the first man, was created mortal, so that whether he had sinned or not, he would have died in body, That is, he would have gone forth of the body, not because his sin merited this, but by natural necessity, let him be anathema. Let him be excommunicated. Their second position was that they thought that transmission of sin, taught by St. Paul, referred to a transmission of death. Death was there all along, and anytime St. Paul says death or sin is transmitted, he's talking about death is transmitted. And again, St. Paul's verses are very clear. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Right? He's talking here very clear about death and sin as two separate things, but never talking about them separately. Death and sin are always together, but two separate things, not the same. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. And finally, Adam caused humanity to sin, yet not by generation, but by imitation. He said the sin was not by generation. It was not just there by the birth of a new child. No, it was by imitation. When that child grows up and remembers the thought of that, even if they don't remember it, they're doing it by imitation. That's what the followers of Pelagius would say. Right? So man is born mortal, yet sins when he becomes aware of Adam's sin. So when they remember that Adam disobeyed God, they begin to disobey God. So the church was very clear on this. First, they began by saying that therefore, as through one man's offense, judgment came to all men, resulting in condemnation, even so, through one man's righteous act, a free gift came to all men, resulting in justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. So he's talking here very clearly that the disobedience is not by imitation. Even if they have no idea who Adam was or what Adam did, they're disobedient. This is very interesting because the idea is, or the narrative, the story out there is that St. Augustine is the one that came up with the doctrine, the original sin. Right? Some people might have heard that. It was St. Augustine who came up with it. But here in one of his letters, he writes clearly and he says, I'm only following in the footsteps of the fathers who came before me. And he's talking about 11 of them who have discussed, who have spoken, who have taught, who have written about the original sin before him. Whether or not they spoke about it in the same way, this is a different story. But he's not the originator of the idea, he's not the inventor of the idea. So he says people like Irenaeus, Cyprian of Carthage, Eutychius, Olympius, Hilary, Ambrose, Gregory, Innocent, John Chrysostom, St. Basil Caesarea, and to whom I add, whether you wish it or not, the priest Jerome. Right? So he's saying all of this, that these people wrote. You know what's missing here? Anybody notice? A couple of big names. At least you will know one of the bigger names. Called the teacher of the church. He's not a father or a saint. No, Saint Athanasius is a saint, and a father in the church. But one of those big names that is missing, we call him a teacher, not a saint, not a father. Origen is missing, and a bit earlier than him, Tertullian is also missing. Both of them were kind of pushed aside and said, you guys are not, whether in their lives or after they died, they're not part of the tradition. They're teachers, they wrote some things that are beneficial, but not everything. So he doesn't mention them, right? He follows in the kind of the canonical, the church approved tradition of these fathers. With Tertullian, he has some problems, he doesn't include them. Origen has some problems, he doesn't, although they did write about these things. So these 11 wrote about the original sin, and really we need to look at what they wrote in order for us to understand fully what St. Augustine is saying about the original sin. And not just buy into that narrative that he was the one that did it, he was the one that invented it, and all that stuff. There are people who wrote about it before. But what they wrote, was it the same? Was it different? We need to look into it some more. But this is a story for another time. The questions that come out of this discussion, though, is what happened to the human nature when Adam sinned? Are we still able to make the right decision? Are we still able to be moral? Are we still able to be good? What exactly happened? What changed? We say that human nature was corrupt. Are human beings capable of doing good apart from God? When exactly did Christ restore the image? Right? He came to restore the image, to fix it that was distorted, that was corrupt. At what point? And was it at a point? Was it by his incarnation? Was it by his death on the cross? Was it by his resurrection, ascension, at Pentecost? At what point? Or in fact, is it a point? Or is it more than one place? And if he came and he took away the power of death, and he gave us forgiveness of sins, remission of sins, why do people still die? And why any child must be baptized at all? Like, your parents are baptized, why do you need to be baptized? You're coming from parents who are baptized, right? So these are all important questions I need to think about, and we can discuss them another time. The point is that we cannot just take the narrative for granted that, you know what, St. Augustine invented the original sin and the church doesn't believe in that, and the fathers don't believe in that, because a lot of them wrote on it, and some wrote not in favor of it. And I'll give you a couple of examples that we need also to take that into account. And what did those people mean? What about the patristic writings that seem to go against St. Augustine's doctrine of original sin? That the Eastern Fathers have a different doctrine of original sin. Like St. Cyril, for example, he writes, what do we have to do with Adam's sin? And he starts to explain. In his commentary on Romans. And we need to notice something very curious before we move on. Illustrations go both ways. So both camps, people who do believe in the original sin, people who do not believe in it, they use similar illustrations. We see in the fathers, a child born of a sick mother, right? The mother is sick and she transmits the disease to the son, and therefore the son has it. So they use that to support the fact that the original sin is transmitted from father to son. The other side as well, the people who do not believe in the original sin, use that as well, the same illustration. A child born in jail, Christ comes in to free the mother and the child. But the child born in jail is born in slavery. And again, these illustrations are used by both sides. So our understanding of this doctrine, I think most of us take it on a very basic level. We need to dig in a little deeper to understand really what the fathers meant by original sin. And I hope I showed you today that many of them did in fact speak about it. But did they say the same thing that St. Augustine said, or did they say something different? This again, another story for a different time. Back to free will. What is free will, and what does it have to do with the grace of God, or with the divine will? This is St. John Cassian. So St. John came to Egypt. He visited all the major centers of monasticism. He visited Nitria, Kilia, he visited a little bit south in Skyries, and he visited all the big names, and he went back and wrote about what they said, what they taught. So in the 13th conference, he writes this. This is, by the way, the most controversial of his conferences, because it deals with this heresy of Pelagius. He says, for the God of all must be held to work in all, so as to incite, protect, and strengthen, but not to take away the freedom of the will which he himself has once given. So we begin to see here that free will is something that is God-given. God gave us free will. And this line is very consistent in all the fathers, that this gift of the free will is something from God. If, however, any more subtle inference of man's argumentation and reasoning seems opposed to this interpretation, it should be avoided rather than brought forward to the destruction of the faith. He said, if you start thinking about this too much, it might lead you to the destruction of the faith, because it's something that is beyond your capability, beyond your ability to reason. What happened? What comes first, the chicken or the egg? How do they interact? Is it God's will coming in or my will? What comes first, and how do they work together exactly? So this is what he says. For we gain not faith from understanding, but understanding from faith, as it is written in Isaiah 7:9, unless you believe, you will not understand. I highlighted here the important part. He said, for how God works all things in us, and yet everything can be ascribed to free will, cannot be fully grasped by the mind and reason of men. You cannot fully understand this. Essentially saying what this is a mystery. This is a mystery. We're going to go and see what other people have said, and we're going to come back and see how it makes sense here. So he's writing here in the 4th century, and he begins to speak about the church, the rule of faith. That this understanding of God giving us free will, this is the rule of faith. This is something that is standard. This is our standard understanding of where this comes from. Moving back to the 2nd century, mid-2nd century, St. Justin Martyr. He writes that each man, by free choice, acts rightly or sins, and that it is by the influence of the wicked demons that earnest men, such as Socrates and the like, suffer persecution and are in bonds, while I can never pronounce his name, and Epicurus and the like, seem to be blessed in abundance and glory. The Stoics, not observing this, maintain that all things take place according to the necessity of faith. So, a little crash course in Greek philosophy. So, beginning with Socrates. All we know about Socrates is what Plato wrote. We have nothing from Socrates. And basically, what he believes about free will is that first, he believes that virtue is a form of knowledge. So the more you know, the more virtuous you are. When you reflect on your actions, this is a good thing. This is free will. Your inability to reflect, when you sin, you become a slave to sin, and you no longer have free will. You no longer reflect on your actions. So basically, to him, free will amounts to knowledge, and ignorance amounts to slavery. So it has nothing to do with the passions, with desires. It has nothing to do with God or any faculty in man. It's basically just contemplation and reflection on your actions. With that second group, Epicurus and the like, they are what we call the 5th century BC. They're atomists. They believe in atoms. They're Greek philosophers. They believe that the world is made up of atoms, of these little indestructible, indivisible bits of matter. And how these bits of matter interact determines everything in the world. Except for him, he came up with a different theory that these bits of matter, these atoms, don't travel only in a straight line. Sometimes they curve. And because they curve, there's some sort of chance for randomness. There's some place in his philosophy for free will. But Epicurus was a happy guy. To him, escape from fear is kind of escape from anxiety. As long as you're not anxious, things will be okay, things will be fine. And he was always happy. Even when he was sick, he was always happy and cheerful. And that's why I noticed a little bit, like Justin Martyr is very familiar with the Greek philosophers and their thoughts and their teachings. And finally with the Stoics. The Stoics, and we talked a little bit earlier about fatalism, about their belief in fate. They had something about emotions coming from incorrect judgments. When you make a mistake, you make a wrong decision, an emotion pops out. To get rid of that, just make the right decision. But it has nothing to do with free will, with right and wrong. Fate is controlling all that stuff. The point is that for you to make right decisions, so you're not feeling bad about it. St. Ignatius of Antioch, he wrote 7 letters, 6 to churches and 1 as a personal letter. and I recommend that you read these 7 letters. They're very, very useful, very, very instructive. He says, seeing then all things have an end, and there is set before us life upon our observance of God's precepts, but death as the result of disobedience, and everyone according to the choice he makes shall go to his own place. Let us flee from death and make choice of life. Again, he's coming up here and saying very clearly that we do, in fact, believe in free will, and that this free will is coming to us from God. It's a gift from God. And not just that there is free will, but there are consequences to it. There are consequences to our actions, to our decisions. Right? It's very clear with him here. There are consequences when we make the wrong decision. And the wrong decision amounts to what? What is a wrong decision? To go to engineering, or to go to medicine, to go to the Caribbean, or to go... What is a wrong decision? Starts with a D. No? Disobedience, thank you. Very good. St. Clement of Alexandria, late 2nd century, is a philosopher. He knows very well philosophy, he learned it, and he has no problem, has no fear of integrating philosophy and theology. He says, neither praise nor censures, neither reward nor punishments are right when the soul has not the power of inclination or disinclination, but evil is involuntary. So you know what, we think of this stuff today, like someone commits an accident, someone is drunk and gets behind the wheel. Are they responsible for what they do? If they kill someone, are they held responsible? Right? These questions are coming up today, and we start to think, well, they weren't in control of their faculties. They couldn't decide, they couldn't make that judgment. They weren't able to do it at the time. Were they really responsible? But if some had been made by nature bad and others good, these latter would not be deserving of praise for being good. So if we follow this line of thinking, if we say, you know what, it wasn't my fault, by nature I'm not able to make decisions. We should also take it to the other side and say, when we do something good, when you get an A+ for an example in an exam, you shouldn't be praised for it. Just say, sorry, it's not me, it's the genes. My parents gave me good genes. I had nothing to do with it. I'm just following my biological makeup. Right? So he's making that distinction here and making that argument that we are in fact responsible for our actions, for our decisions. Cyrenius, late 2nd century. And Against the Heresies is a very good book. It's very quick in terms of dealing with a huge list of heresies, and he's very straightforward, very to the point. He says, this expression, our Lord, how often would I have gathered your children together, and you would not set forth the ancient law of human liberty. Because he's saying here, I tried to gather you, I tried to bring you all together, but you refused. This shows how much liberty God gave us, even to oppose him, to reject him, to disobey him. From the beginning, possessing his own power, even as he does his own soul, to obey the behests of God voluntarily and not by compulsion of God. It's all about being voluntarily obedient. For there is no coercion with God, but a good will towards us is present with him continually. And therefore does he give good counsel to all. And in man, as well as in angels, he has placed the power of choice. For angels are rational beings, so that those who have yielded obedience might justly possess what is good, given indeed by God, but preserved by themselves. God is giving you the opportunity to obey or disobey. He wants you to obey, but voluntarily, not by compulsion. If we move a little bit forward, Hippolytus. He's in Rome. He had problems with the Roman Pope, or Pope of Rome, and he kind of left the church and declared himself a pope, like an anti-pope. So it was the pope and the anti-pope, and they had a clash, and both were exiled, and they reconciled in exile. And the day after, they were both martyred. They died in exile. So, but he is very much orthodox. For man is able to both will and not to will. He is endowed with power to do both. Endowed with power to do both. As we can see, these church fathers are able to have very deep thoughts, very logical, very reasonable thoughts about what it is to be human, what it is to choose, what it is to make the right decision or to not make the right decision. It's not like they were uneducated, unlearned, ignorant, unfit for leadership or anything like that. Move on to origin. And origin sheds a lot of light in this issue. This also is clearly defined in the teaching of the church that every rational soul is possessed of free will and volition. So now he introduces a new bit or a new ingredient to the mix. He says that you have volition. And some people say just because you can go against your free will, like you want to do something, but you say better not. That negates the idea of free will, and in fact it's an illusion. But the fact that you have self-control, that you say, I should do this, or I shouldn't do this, it doesn't mean that you don't have free will. It means the opposite, that you do in fact have free will. Remember that verse in Rome? That problematic verse about predestination. In the scripture, words like foreknew and predestined. Remember, where is that? St. Paul, Romans. They do not apply equally to both good and evil. The verse is very clear about those who predestined applies to those who love God. For all things work together for those who love God. So it's for those who love God. Those are people who He has foreknowledge of them and predestination. But they do not apply equally to those who are evil. For the careful student of the Bible will realize that these words are used only for the good. When God speaks of evil people, remember the parable of the wise virgins and the foolish virgins. What happens? The foolish virgins come later on, they knock on the door, and He says to them, what does He say to them? I don't know you, right? So it doesn't apply equal to the good and to the bad. They are not said to be foreknown, not because there's anything that can escape God's knowledge, which is present everywhere and nowhere absent, but because everything which is evil is considered to be unworthy of His knowledge or of His foreknowledge. This is the Damascene, John of Damascus, in the 7th, 8th century. This was a place outside of the control at the time of the Byzantine Empire. It was under Persian rule, and this is what he said. For it is not His will that there should be wickedness, nor does He choose to compel virtue. So the idea here of everything has to be voluntary is very clear, very straightforward. The things have to be voluntary. He does not compel you to be courageous. He does not compel you to be honest. He does not compel you to be truthful. He wants it to be done voluntarily. Otherwise, it is not virtue. Otherwise, you're a slave, in the truest sense of the word. He also writes, we ought to understand that while God knows all things beforehand, so when we say those whom He foreknew, He also predestined. He says that predestination does not mean predetermination. He makes a very strong distinction. This predestination does not mean predetermination. So He has not predetermined all things, for He knows beforehand those things that are in our power, but He does not predetermine them. So we can see that the church fathers are very much engaged with our thoughts today, our questions today, and they're able to shed so much light on them. And finally, our father, Saint Cyril, coming in the 5th century. To be called according to God's purpose is to be called according to the will. But is this the will of the one who calls, or the will of those who are called? Whose will is it? Is it my will or God's will? Naturally, every impulse which leads to righteousness comes from God the Father. Christ Himself once said, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. Nevertheless, it is not wrong to say that some are called according to God's purpose, and at the same time according to their own intentions as well. When the two wills align, the God's will does not cancel out, does not negate our will, human will. This is really who we are. We are the choices that we make. And our choices not only affect us, but affect every single person around us. We need to be aware of this, that God gave us such a huge responsibility. You are free. And when the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. I want to just leave you with a couple of words. That you are indeed free to choose. He says very clearly to Moses, see, I've set before you life and death. So choose life and live. It's very clear. So you're free to choose. But you're not free not to choose. You're free to choose, but you're not free not to choose. You have to make a choice. Life is a bunch of choices. And you're also not free to choose the consequences. You cannot determine the consequence of your actions. These are said. There's a consequence for every decision you make. And you need to be aware of it before you make it. That's why it's very important for us to understand the value of this gift. The fathers give us an idea of that this gift is the image of God. This is the image of God that He gave us. This free will. And our likeness to Him grows every day as we use this free gift to imitate Him. As St. Paul says in Ephesians, to be imitators of Christ. To imitate Him. In the way He made decisions. In the way He used this free will. Thank you. If you have any questions, if we haven't answered any of the questions that we mentioned at the beginning, I know there's a lot of heavy stuff today, but this is the graduate group. So you guys are a bunch of smart guys and girls, so I'm sure it was nothing for you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to.
So just a question about this maybe a bit superficial, but when it comes to arbitrary decisions that you know, like you don't know what the consequences are, it a lot of times in our language we say, oh, this is God, like this must be God's will. What is God's will? But how do we look at those decisions? Like, part of me wants to say that it really doesn't matter, and you should just go with whatever you want to do, as long as you know that this is not going to lead to sin.
Right.
So that's how I approach
Okay.
that sort of thing. But I wasn't sure if that's
So you said two words that I want you to clarify for us. Arbitrary and not knowing the consequences. So what do you mean by an arbitrary decision?
so it doesn't matter.
So it doesn't matter what you choose.
They're both
They're both equal. Okay. So if they're both equal,
at this point in time.
at this okay. And then that leads us to our next point. Knowing or not knowing the consequences.
So you know, as far as you're concerned, they're both good.
They're both equal, right? So there's a difference between, as far as I know they're good or they're equal, and when I don't know the consequences, right? We always need to know the consequences of our decisions before we make them, right? We need to know. God never made a secret commandment. It was always well known, published, advertised, given to the people. It was always out there, right? Before any sort of expectations are set, right? So the idea that we do know the consequences before we make the decision is there. Not fully being able to understand the consequences or understand the impact or the implications of my action, this is a different story. In that situation, we always need to have, just as the fathers had. They're always walking in the footsteps of those who came before them, right? And working in that same spirit, in that same mind, to push things forward, but never without guidance, right? So guidance is something that was essential for them, and it is for us. In the Orthodox Church, we all have guidance, and if we don't have guidance, we have a problem, right? So always seek guidance, always ask, but the idea that decisions don't matter, that's not true. They might be, in the short term, equal in the consequences, but I have to kind of give it some thought and pray about it and seek guidance. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming.